Chapter 27. To Grandmother's house we go. Mr. Teller asked the waitress if the little town had a car rental business. She nodded and gave the nice man the directions, and the group walked the 5 blocks to the only rental business in town. When they arrived, there was already a crowd of desperate train passengers looking for transportation out of there. U-Rent was just a small little shop, ill-equipped to handle such demand. Adam looked around the small lot, quickly calculating that there were not enough cars. Mr. Teller came to the same conclusion. Verona asked Jack, "What are we going to do now?" Mr. Teller overheard her. He looked around, assessing the situation. Then he made his own calculations, prompting him to pull out his wallet. He peeked over at Yvonne, and she gave him a knowing nod. Samuel, a salesman himself, slipped one of the young U-Rent workers a $100 bill, then convinced the young man to rent them the last minivan the small business had. They all felt bad about jumping in front of the others, waiting in the long lines, but there were 5 children lost in the middle of nowhere, desperate to get help and to get back to their loved ones. This reality outweighed their guilt. The young man was able to work some magic and eventually motioned the group to follow him out back. They all piled in just out of view of the other stranded train passengers. The vehicle had just enough room for 8 people, the teller's luggage, and 3 wet backpacks. Jack, Lake, and Lincoln sat in the 3rd row, all the way in the back. During the trip, Jack mainly looked out the window, for he had never seen such beautiful landscapes before. But Jack's eyes felt heavy, and after a while, he drifted off to sleep. Lake and Lincoln began to talk. Verona noticed that Lincoln wasn't wearing his headphones. She didn't know what the 7- and 8-year-old kids were talking about, but Lincoln was smiling, and he seemed to be enjoying Lake's company. Verona could not remember the last time she saw Lincoln carry on a conversation, let alone speak to another person who wasn't herself. Although his voice was still very low, Verona watched as her shy little brother showed his new friend his purple hat. Verona became overwhelmed with emotion, and tears started running down her cheeks. Adam, who got stuck sitting next to Verona, believed he already knew why she was emotional. But feeling uncomfortable, he asked if she was okay. Malcolm was sitting on the other side of Adam and just kept on babbling throughout the whole trip, repeating the words, "Stick together, hold them, sabotage, steal it, touch the burning man," and scream, in varying orders and volumes. Adam finally asked Mr. Teller, "Do you know what Malcolm is saying and why he's saying it?" Mr. Teller turned and looked at the children. A pleasant expression came over her face before she spoke. "Malcolm is a sweet child with sweet quirks. I have no idea why he says the things he says, but I would like to believe that he has a very good reason for saying them." Mrs. Teller smiled at her son. When they all got into the van, Mr. Teller offered to call Adam's grandmother, but Adam lied and told them that he only had her number on his phone, and he lost his phone on the train in the chaos. However, Adam gave the man the address, and Mr. Teller entered it into his phone's map feature. 2 hours later, the van was pulling up at 444 Angels Avenue, Mountain, North Dakota. Malcolm, Mr. and Mrs. Teller, got out with the kids to stretch. Mr. Teller shook Adam and Verona's hands, smiled at Lincoln and Lake, and then said, "Thanks again. I hope you all find what you're looking for." Adam thought it was a curious thing to say and wondered if, somehow, he had figured them out. Mrs. Teller and Malcolm walked the children up the driveway to the front door. The house was a rustic-looking, gray wood siding, 2-story home. The side of the home had ivy growing up its walls, which crept slightly around the front bottom corner of the home on the left. There was also some moss on the roof next to the chimney that had a faint blue smoke trickling up out of it. However, it was not unruly. It was actually very beautiful. The landscaping was simple but very clean, and the place had a homey and cozy vibe evident even from the outside. Although Mountain, North Dakota sits at a relatively high altitude, ironically, it is not on a mountain. In fact, the entire town is actually very flat, with only one fairly medium-sized hill, and Adam's grandmother's house sat on the very top of it. The property had a short gravel driveway with an old station wagon sitting in it. The porch had a couple of old rocking chairs and dozens of colorful wind chimes that made lovely sounds, welcoming them as they approached. The door was a deep shade of purple with a door knocker in the shape of a crescent moon. Adam took a deep breath, not knowing what was going to happen next, and knocked. A few minutes later, a woman opened the door. She looked to be in her late 50s or early 60s. She was wearing a purple dress that draped full length to the floor and swept the ground as she walked. The woman had long gray hair that was immaculately well-kempt, and although she looked a bit puzzled, she greeted the group with a warm smile. Mrs. Teller turned and looked at Adam, wondering why it appeared as if the woman had not been expecting the children. Then Adam spoke up and said, "Nurin? I'm Adam Worthy, your grandson." The old woman looked at him, then glanced down the driveway towards the van before reaching out her arms, smiling and saying, "Of course you are, my dear." Then she gave Adam a warm hug. Afterward, she turned to the young girl and said, "And you must be little Lakey. Happy birthday, sweetheart." Lake smiled and immediately jumped into the arms of the grandmother she had never met before that moment. Nurin then whispered in Lake's ear, "I like your necklace." She subtly repositioned her body between Lake and the others and secretly revealed the necklace she was wearing. It was also a golden crescent moon, only it was facing the opposite direction. Lake stared in wonder before realizing that her mom must have originally gotten the necklace from her mother, Lake's grandmother. Adam spoke up. "This is Verona, Lincoln, Jack, Malcolm, and Malcolm's mom, Mrs. Teller." Nurin stood back upright and looked at the group. Then she said, "It is a pleasure to make your acquaintances, but you mentioned 5 more people, and I only see 4. Adam turned to look at his friends. Then it dawned on him. "Where's Jack?" he questioned. The group looked around, and for a moment, Adam wondered if Jack had actually turned invisible. Just then, he saw Mr. Teller and Jack walking up the driveway. Mr. Teller called out, "Look who is still asleep in the back of the van." They just made it up to the door when Mr. Teller said, "Well, I think we need to get going before it gets dark. I presume we're leaving these 5 with you then." Nurin paused for a second and glanced at Adam. He was looking at his grandmother with a desperate and pleading look on his face. Then Nurin nodded her head, indicating it was okay. Jack looked around and said, "Huh? I thought Mountain, North Dakota would have been a lot more mountainy than this." Everyone, including Nurin, looked around, assessing the landscape. Then Mr. Teller broke the silence by saying, "Well, we better be off." Mrs. and Mr. Teller said their goodbyes, and Mrs. Teller got a few more bear hugs as she thanked each of them one last time. The kids all said goodbye to Malcolm. Malcolm half smiled and nodded at the group. Then, a look of concern came across his face, and he once again said, "Stick together." Jack dismissively said, Okay. Lake shot a stern look at him and commanded, "Everyone, listen to Malcolm." He repeated the phrases he had been saying since meeting the kids, but this time with much more conviction. He looked at Verona and pleaded, "Sabotage! Sabotage!" Then yelled, "Hold 'em!" at Adam. The kids were now feeling uncomfortable once again. Malcolm continued shouting, "Steal it!" to Jack and "Scream!" to Lincoln. The children were mesmerized. Lake walked up to Malcolm and put both of her hands on Malcolm's shoulders. With this, Malcolm calmed down considerably. Then he leaned in and whispered, "Touch the burning man." Lake listened to her young friend, then replied, "I will." The rest of them didn't understand what was happening, but they all started nodding as if to reassure little Malcolm. After that, they all stood in silence for a few more moments until Mrs. Teller grabbed Malcolm's hand. They turned, and Malcolm, Mr. and Mrs. Teller, started walking back down the driveway toward the rented van. Malcolm once again started yelling so all could hear him as he walked away, "Stick together!" But this time, he added for the first time, "It's the only way!" The Tellers entered the vehicle and drove away, giving one last wave as they exited the driveway. The group stood on the porch, watching the van as it drove out of sight down the hill. Adam broke the silence when he turned to his grandmother and blurted, "There was an accident.